Hello, everybody. It's time for another lecture this week. We've been away for a few weeks with spring break and you working on your second response paper, but we're moving along pretty quickly, and it's time to get back into the text, Potter, and the new book that we'll be reading starting this week by Charles Dew, Apostles of Disunion. All right, if you can go back a few weeks and remember where we left off, it was John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry was really the key moment that we left with, and I'm sure you recall what a powerful moment that was as a raid, as an attempt to start a rebellion or to an insurrection. It was an utter failure and disaster, but as a symbol of what many were coming in the North to believe, the immorality of slavery or the need to end the institution. It was very powerful. Or the opposite, the other side of that coin, in the South, it's a very powerful moment because of the Northern response. So that's kind of where we left off, and now we're headed into playing all these issues out in the presidential election of 1860. But there are other things going on, right? There's this growing rift between the North and the South. There's this growing sense of distrust. There's this growing sense of separateness. The South feels it's headed in one direction. The North feels it's headed in one direction. And the question is, can we move forward as a nation? Or is there no choice but to separate? The South is alarmed, like I said, by the response to John Brown's raid, and this is increasingly playing out in our federal government. As you read in Potter's book, that our Congress and our senators are coming to Washington D.C. armed and prepared for violence. Can you imagine what that must have been like? What we expect, a certain level of decorum or behavior in those halls, those hallowed halls, right? But Congress is a mess. Congress is a mess, and we're headed towards a presidential election. And I think it's great that we're reading this section in Potter's book right now with our own presidential election heating up this year. So it's very interesting to see these politics play out. We've talked increasingly about the split of the Democratic Party, and that happens finally as we move toward the election of 1860, the presidential election. The party finally splits, and this is important. Why? Well, because the Democratic Party was a cross-sectional party. It was the party that kind of held the nation together. We had Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats that, although they may have had different ideas about government, about slavery, about westward expansion, all those things, they may have had different ideas, they were still one party, and that held the nation together. They were still allies on that level. But the presidential election is going to be the straw that breaks the camel's back, because it's going to finally split the Democratic Party. Potter goes into this in detail in his book, but I want to just touch base on it. Of course, the Northern Democrats, Stephen Douglas, kind of the perennial favorite among Northern Democrats, he ultimately will be nominated by that section of the Democratic Party. And why? Well, in the North, he's willing to compromise. He is not necessarily pro-slavery, he's not anti-slavery, and he is dedicated to keeping the Union together. So he wants to keep the nation together, and he's trying to do that while allowing slavery to continue and its expansion. We've known or learned that over the semester, right? The Southern Democrats, of course, this is their reason for disliking Douglas, is that he is willing to compromise, and they feel like he is too willing to sacrifice or give up what is so important to Southerners, and that is the institution of slavery, the right to maintain that institution and to expand that institution. So they fear that Douglas may give up too much of what is so important to them. So Southern Democrats end up nominating John Breckinridge, and that nomination has split the party. We have now a Northern Democratic Party, a Southern Democratic Party that have nominated two different people to run for president of the United States. So clearly, it's pretty obvious that we can't have a president of the United States because we have two separate individuals running for that office. A third party, I'm not going to get too deep into this. Potter covers it, but the Constitutional Union Party is another party that nominates John Bell during the presidential election of 1860. So let's turn to the Republicans, right? What have they done? Well, the Republicans are kind of in chaos too. They're looking for a candidate that can win. And isn't that fascinating? A fascinating comparison to what we see today. We see several candidates campaigning for the same office, the presidential nomination, and the Republican Party today, and not to pick on them, it just so happens to be how it's working, but they're looking for the candidate that can win the election. So that remains to be seen. But back to our Republican Party. The Republican Party of 1860 is a coalition of people, of different agendas and platforms, right? You have the anti-slavery forces have migrated to the Republican Party, those people that want to see slavery end, or at the very least not see slavery expand. It is also a party of internal improvements, and we maybe have touched on that a little bit in this class, but internal improvements are things like the building of canals, roads, railroads, things that will expand the nation and tie it together economically. That is the northern agenda, because the north of course is trying to expand west just as the south is, and to make that successful, to build the nation, we have to connect it, right? It does people no good to live here, let's say in Indiana, and have no way to access economic markets to sell their goods, to ply their trade. So people that favor internal improvements and government-sponsored internal improvements. Moderates that are attracted not necessarily to the anti-slavery position, but those people that are interested in preserving the Union, they go toward the Republican Party. Immigrants end up, to some extent, attracted to the Republican Party because it's not the Know-Nothing Party. If you recall, the Know-Nothing Party is a nativist party. It's anti-immigration largely. So the Republican Party is, to an extent, able to shed its association with that anti-immigrant sentiment. And the flip side of that is nativists are also attracted to the Republican Party because they want to see westward expansion. So you see we have all these groups of people who seem on the surface maybe not related or independent of one another, but deep down they find some common ground, and the Republican Party starts to look around for the guy that can hold that coalition together. And who is it? Well, we know who it is, of course. It's Abraham Lincoln. He is a moderate, and he is he's a westward expansion. He's from the West, right? He is in favor of internal improvements. He is morally opposed to slavery, even though we will know that he is not claims not to be interested in ending slavery where it exists, but he is morally opposed to slavery. So he becomes the guy that the Republicans believe can carry the day in the presidential election of 1860. And now all of a sudden we have two elections. We have a presidential election in the North and a presidential election in the South, right? Because the South is not even looking to Abraham Lincoln. He's not even on the presidential ballot in 10 states in the South. So the unfortunate side effect of that is that the Republicans are growing increasingly confident that they can win the election with Lincoln and without the South. And they don't attempt to carry Lincoln's message or the Republican message to the South. And as a result, they have no real good feeling about the mood of the South. So you have these two sections fighting to elect a president of the nation, and they really are out of touch. They really are not interested in hearing from the opposition. And we know, of course, that lack of communication is going to cause an irreparable breakdown after the election. The South can't trust Lincoln. They're not willing to trust him because they don't know him, and Lincoln, the Republicans, are not willing to get the South to trust them because they don't need them. They can win the election without Southern votes. Many Southerners view that the Republican Party has the sole agenda of destroying the Southern way of life, especially in the Deep South, where they feel that they are in the minority. This is the Cotton Belt, where slavery is so vital to the culture and continued economic stability of that region. And they feel like if Lincoln or the Republicans win this election, we're out. We have no power. We have no say-so. And it doesn't matter if the Republicans today promise or Lincoln promises not to interfere with slavery. It doesn't matter today because that might change tomorrow or a month from now or a year from now. So it is a threat, a direct threat to the Southern way of life. Well, Potter really breaks down the votes, the popular vote and the electoral vote. We know how this turns out, right? The great Abraham Lincoln is elected in the presidential election of 1860, and he is now the president of the so-called United States in a nation where people from 10 states did not even put him on their ballot. Right? He wins no electoral votes in the South. His victory comes completely from the North, and now he's in charge, running a country with another section that was not even interested in putting him in the election or making him part of their election. How can that possibly work? We know, right? That's a recipe for disaster, and it becomes that, of course. There's kind of a myth that it was the Democrat split that wins Lincoln the election. That's not necessarily the case, and you can see that with Potter's breakdown of the vote. But the Electoral College of 1860, Lincoln has enough votes just in the states that he wins, basically, to carry the day, whether or not the Democrats had joined forces and selected just one candidate to run nationally. So he wins, and this was kind of one of the early recognitions by a political party of that critical control or capture of those electoral votes, right, which we're so familiar with today. It's playing out right now. I'm sure if you turn on CNN at this moment, you'll see something about red states and blue states and who has to win which states to become our next president. All right, so the election's over, and how does the South respond? Well, we know that the South is going to respond with secession, and that's where we bring in Apostles of Disunion this week, which you're going to start reading by Charles Dew. This is one of my personal favorites. Dew makes a very compelling argument in his book Apostles of Disunion. You're just reading kind of the introduction this week, and Dew is admittedly a Southerner, right? He is admittedly a guy that grew up in the South, believing that the Civil War was fought over states' rights. It was a war of northern aggression where the South had to defend itself from this aggressive North, right? The party of Lincoln and these people that are allegedly whose sole purpose in life is to destroy the Southern way of life. We know now that that's not true. He grew up believing that this is a war fought for independence of the South, right? Which nations have a right to do. People, I should say, have a right to do. to abolish a government that is no longer working for them, right? Isn't that what we did in the American Revolution? So Dew comes into this book admitting that. That's how he grew up, right? Until he got into the reading of what we call the secession commissioners, because as Lincoln is the presidential election of 1860 is running, and there is talk of secession. There's no way, and many people in the South believe that they can go on if Lincoln and the Republicans win. So secession obviously is on the lips of some people. And these apostles of disunion, they go out into the South, other southern states, and basically try to convince their fellow southern states to secede. And why? What is the number one reason they use to justify secession? Charles Dew is going to tell us that as we read his book. Is it states' rights? Is it northern aggression? Well, you know where I stand on that. I think most of us are in agreement. It's slavery, right? Is there a states' rights connection to slavery? Of course there is. It is the states' right to keep that institution, right? It is the personal, the individual right to keep that property, or to take that property with you where you go. But this is, like I said, very powerful, a great argument. I love the book. It's short and sweet, so I hope you appreciate that. It's a great read. Dew's a good writer, so I look forward to that. This week we have a discussion due. Beyond that, have a great week, and I look forward to hearing from everybody in the discussion boards.